You're
You are
on.
live.
Thank you, and welcome again to the meeting of the AIB for Monday, February the 7th, 2002. I want to welcome everybody back. I apologize for being away for a few days. Unfortunately, I had a really difficult schedule over the last 12 days. My wife and I had planned a trip to the Antarctic, an exploration, if you will. And I felt that it was my duty to accompany her on this very difficult trip. So we're back in one piece, warm, happy, and safe. So we're back. Let me, first of all, thank all of you for welcoming and thanking our new executive director. This is her official first day. I want to thank the committee and all of the board members for your hard work and going through the process of evaluating the candidates that we had and making sure that we came out in a way that I think that we're all very satisfied with. So Rachel, thank you for accepting our offer. I want to thank Fagan and especially Britt for your hard work and getting us through this process. And I think we've come out with an outstanding director to keep us abreast, to make certain that we're following all of the procedures and to get us back on schedule for the many tasks that are ahead of us. So thank you, Rachel. I'm not sure you want to say a few words in acknowledgement of that, but thank you for accepting the offer.
Thank you so much. I'll just very briefly say, I'm really looking forward to both the challenge and the opportunity of implementing the blueprint and getting it right. So thank you for having faith in me.
Thank you. Our first item on the agenda today is open remarks and organizational matters. There are a couple of matters that I want to, again, acknowledge the hard work of the board members along with Rachel, because we've had some organizational challenges. Those challenges were have impacted the work and getting us off on a rather smooth start. But when you consider the work ahead, the challenges that we have, I look at those as blimps, hiccups, and not things that should deter us from achieving the overall mission that we have in order to ensure the proper implementation of this very important legislation. With that in mind, as I indicated earlier, a special thanks to Fagan and Britt for the work and the selection of the executive director. Joe has done a tremendous amount of work in putting together the information regarding a recommendation that we will ultimately look at for the advisory committees. Unfortunately, we're not going to look at that today for a variety of reasons. One, we're still working to make certain that we have proper communication access, the proper ability for the outside public to contact us, because whenever we make a decision on whatever arrangement we have, we want to make certain that goes smoothly. So Joe, I know there was a note in your comments also recognizing that we need to wait until we have that in place. But we will start with the recommendation. Again, say it's a recommendation that Joe has been working on for consideration. If there are other ideas or components that you want to add to that or a full discussion of that, we'll have that at a later date. But we're not going to move forward on that until we're prepared to, in effect, ensure that we have a smooth transition. Because the moment we announce that, I'm certain, based on the context that I've heard from, that there are a number of people who would like to apply, and we want to make certain that that will go fairly quickly. So maybe you want to just talk about that just for a second, Rachel, in terms of where we are with making certain we get all those pieces together.
Sure. I'm working with the executive branch to do all the many things that I wasn't fully aware of to get a new state agency up and running. It doesn't happen very often. And it's sort of, we're starting from scratch. So we're working with the various agencies in the executive branch to move forward with being able to have a website, have the ability to collect information, have people like upload applications and things like that. So we're going to need to develop a website, and we're going to do that as quickly as we possibly can.
Okay. Joe, are you okay with what I've just stated in terms of the time and reflection of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think just in terms of communicating out to the public, we definitely would need the website available and up and running so people knew what the process was for generating nominations and applying for the advisory positions and fully understanding the structure. So I think clearly having the communication apparatus set up ahead of time is imperative before we move forward with opening up the nomination process.
Okay. I think there needs to be just a comment on the dates that we have for future meetings. Can you go back, Rachel, just to touch base so that everybody's on board with the upcoming meetings and dates and time for Monday?
Absolutely. After today, we're meeting again this Thursday at 4 p.m. And that is when State Superintendent Chaudhary and the State Board President, Clarence Crawford, will be presenting to the board on what the State Board and MSDE have been doing in terms of blueprint implementation to date, and then also their thoughts on potential new timelines for some of the deadlines that are in the blueprint bill that are upcoming very soon. And then next Monday, so a week from today, at 2 o'clock, we are meeting again to discuss. So later on the agenda today, we're going to be talking about the upcoming blueprint timelines and potential changes to that. We're going to meet again in a week to further discuss that once we also have MSDE's thoughts and are able to kind of vet a possible timeline with other stakeholders over the next week. And then if possible, come to consensus next Monday about what potential timeline, what new timeline to propose to the General Assembly. And if we're not able to fully reach that by next Monday, then we'll put that on the agenda for the next meeting, which is not scheduled yet. We're trying to work toward a regular meeting schedule at sort of roughly the same day and time every 2 weeks or so right now, as there's so much going on. And perhaps later we can move to monthly. And so we're working on getting some of those dates set up either for Monday or Thursday late afternoons, most likely.
When we say late afternoon, we're meaning somewhere around 4 or 5, 4 in the afternoon, that time frame.
Right.
Let's have a little bit of reaction to that so that at least you'd have some guidance about that. The inner reaction to that in terms of the potential meetings on Monday, or I think it's Thursday, you said, late afternoon. I think that, based on earlier comments from people, seem to be a much more accommodating time frame. I assume that's silence. Everybody's in agreement with that. Or are there any comments on it?
We're all doing thumbs up. So yeah.
I think it's good both from for multiple different reasons. One, including that I think it makes it easier for the public to be able to watch our meetings. When it's early in the evening, I think it allows more people to participate in the process, which I think is important.
Okay. Well, we'll get back some additional information regarding that, and we'll have 2 additional meetings that we're trying to schedule. One will be that reschedule at the get-together reception that I talked about earlier, as well as a retreat, and we're working on potential dates for both of those, and we'll get back to you with all of that information as well. I want to acknowledge and congratulate Fagan. I was away and I saw all the way down in Antarctica, a brief snippet about his recent accomplishments. And so Fagan, congratulations. We are quite proud of the recognition and proud to have you aboard. and it brings a great deal of attention and focus to the outstanding contribution that all of our members are making. So congratulations, Fagan, on that recent acknowledgement and recognition.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I think that's all I have in terms of overview. There's some additional things that I'd like to have us discuss a little bit later on, but they will be in reference to our closed session. Rachel, I think there are a couple of things that you want to go through, and let's move forward through those as quickly as possible.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Is it big enough?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I wanted to do is just give you a kind of a budget update, both for the AIB's budget, but also other Blueprint programs and the local school systems and their Blueprint funding through the new formulas. So to start off with the Accountability and Implementation Board's budget, just to kind of summarize, right now we have about $700,000 in the fiscal 22 budget to support the AIB. The governor's budget for fiscal 23 includes a deficiency appropriation of about a little under $300,000. And it also includes 5 positions that we've talked about. And then for fiscal 23, the allowance includes the full $4.8 million that is required to be funded. And it includes a total of 15 permanent positions. So that's for the permanent, it could be part-time, but permanent full or part-time positions. There are also the ability to hire contractuals beyond those 15 positions.
Rachel,
Yes,
the 300,000 and the 5 position become available as soon as the General Assembly passes the budget. Is that correct?
that is correct. So that would be most likely in early April. I don't know how like immediate it is, but within a few weeks of that, I would think. And so, speaking of the fiscal 22 budget, the AIB's ability to have its full $4.8 million appropriation, as you know, is dependent on the availability and the timing of when sports betting revenues are generated. And that is part of the Chapter 356 of 2021 that the General Assembly passed. The latest revenue estimate from the Board of Revenue Estimates is projecting $13 million in sports betting revenues in fiscal 22. So if that projection turns out to be correct, then that would provide enough money to fully fund the AIB's $4.8 million budget. And in addition, there are, and at the bottom of the page here are other Blueprint programs that are in Chapter 356 to receive supplementary appropriations in fiscal 22. So that includes for MSDE funding to develop the model curriculum and instructional materials, the funding for expert review teams. And then there's some money to start up the Career and Technical Education Committee or CTE committee. Also about $2 million to start to do some training on the Blueprint. And then $2.5 million for a new financial system for MSDE, which is critical to tracking the school level expenditures. The fiscal 23 budget actually includes a $5 million for the MSDE financial system. So the fact that they might not get this full $2.5 million is probably okay, because you can see the total is about $13.8 million here, and an estimate of $13 million. So we'll just have to see how the revenues flow.
So Rachel, sorry, but the money that will come from sports betting, assuming the money is there, is the 4.8 million. What's the timing of that? How does that get triggered?
So it's just based on, I mean, there are sports betting licenses have been issued now for some of the bigger venues. And so it's just really a question of when, how much revenues start flowing. The Super Bowl's coming up.
So as the revenue flows, it's then allocated to us?
I think, so right now, I'm working with the administration. They've been looking at quarterly distributions. So
Okay.
the first supplementary appropriation up here at the top, number one, was the first quarter, was through revenue that was available through September.
Mhm.
And so I know that they are working on getting another supplementary appropriation to reflect the revenues through December. And then, so I would imagine it would continue to be quarterly. One thing to point out is that these monies, like any appropriation, the money, if it is not used by the end of the fiscal year, it does revert. In this case, it reverts back to the blueprint fund. And so there is a timing issue of, when the money comes through and the ability to spend it.
Well, I want you to pause right there for a moment, because that's an issue that I think that we need to address. And hopefully we'll be able to come to some resolution about what the most appropriate way in which to look at that, because that will in fact be a hindrance if we're not able to fully address that because of the time and the delay in which the time we started and our ability to access the money within the appropriate time frame. So we're going to put a plug on that point. We will come back to that at a later point to discuss what may be some feasible ways in which to appropriately address that issue.
Absolutely. And that affects not just the AIB's funding, but also these other programs here on the list, depending on when those monies come through and the ability to encumber it for purposes in the future. It's going to be a challenge for the monies are going to end up being reverted.
Rachel, could you also speak not just to the budget issues, but the PIN situation, how this these 15 positions, when the PIN numbers become available for those positions?
Sure. So the 5 positions that are in the deficiency appropriation would become available in April, at some point in April. And then the additional 10 positions will become available after July 1st, which is the first of the day of the fiscal year. Now, like I said, there is the ability to bring contractuals on if we find folks that we want to hire and bring them on before July 1 as contractuals, and then can move them into the permanent positions after July 1st.
But I think, Rachel, what we may be looking at here is a question of how does the position and the timing of that coincide with the ability to meet an expected arranged time frame for the work that we have to do. And I guess that's what he was getting at, and we will probably elapse that into the second part of the discussion. So there's a consistency between when we expect to get the monies in the positions and when we are expected to fulfill our requirements based on a date and time frame for moving forward. I guess that's the big question that's out there.
It's definitely one of the big questions, yes. So
Rachel, excuse me, I'm sorry.
sure.
Is there any worst case scenario regarding the 5 positions in April? Is there any opportunity that won't happen?
I mean, so the governor has included them in the budget. The General Assembly does have the ability to reduce the funding and cut the pins if they so wish. So it does still have to go through the budget review and approval process. The AIB will have a budget hearing in both the Senate and the House in March, where the budget will be discussed with the budget committees. And so, hopefully, if they have any questions or concerns, they will, we'll be able to address them.
Thank you.
So if no more questions on this page, we can always come back to. So these, there are also, for fiscal 23, as I said, the AIB does have its full mandated amount in the governor's budget. There are some unfunded blueprint programs for fiscal 23, however, and some of them are also the ones with asterisks are also programs that are scheduled to receive a supplementary appropriation. So they were on the previous page here, but they haven't received fiscal 22 funding yet. And now they're also not funded right now in the fiscal 23 budget. And so I'm going to hold off on the effort adjustment just for a minute. We're going to talk about that. It has to do with the local school systems. These other programs are the funding for these programs is not mandated in the blueprint bill, but it is needed to implement these provisions of the law. And so you can see $7.2 million for training of school leaders and teachers. Again, the funding for MSDE to develop the state model curriculum and high quality instructional materials, funding for the new expert review teams to begin operating in fiscal 23, which is a key part of the blueprint. There's also $1 million to start for MSDE to build out a national board certification support program and to start working with the school systems to support teachers who are pursuing national board certification and also encourage more teachers. Again, the CTE committee, funding for the CTE committee to operate, and also about $700,000 a year for behavioral health training for school system staff. And then finally, there's $500,000 for MSDE in consultation or collaboration, I forget which one, with the AIB is supposed to contract for a college and career readiness study to kind of evaluate what the right levels of knowledge and skills students need to have to be considered college and career ready in high school by the end of 10th grade is the blueprint goal. So that adds up to about $14.2 million that is not included in the 23 budget right now. And if there aren't questions
Yeah, I have a question, Rachel. Yeah, so first of all, it sounds like that parts of the blueprint were mandated and parts were not. So could you say why some parts were not mandated? That's the first question. And secondly, these are very important items, critically important items. So if there isn't money in the budget for them, how do we ever get that money to do these things?
So to answer your first question, in general, legislation that creates programs or well, let's just say that's what all these different things are doing. They're creating programs. The legislation, I would say not only does it not always include a mandate, usually it doesn't. And there's a process where the Department of Legislative Services does a fiscal and policy note analysis and estimates the cost of implementing the law. And then typically, if the law passes, and it is at the executive branch and the governor's discretion, they would then go through and look at all the laws that passed in the prior year and what the estimated cost was. They would, use their own judgment and the agency's judgment in determining how much to budget for it. And they would include money in the budget to implement the law. And so formulas and things that are very knowable to calculate are typically what is mandated. Program costs tend to be harder to, pin down in terms of what the exact cost will be year in and year out. And so they're not, they can be mandated, but they're not definitely not always mandated. And so in this case, for example, for the expert review teams, just as one example, it's, in part going to depend on how many teams there are, what level of folks are hired, at what salaries, that will dictate what the program costs. And it might cost more in the first couple of years as you've got startup costs involved, and then be less in the out years, or it might be the other way and it starts up more slowly and costs more in the future years. So that's typically just all part of the budgeting process.
So
But
if we don't have money for expert review teams, how do we ever get the expert review teams, which we'll need?
it's a problem. So typically the way that the process works is the governor does have the ability to bring down supplemental budgets that include funding in the budget for items that were not included in the original allowance. And so that is the typical process, is to request that the governor include those funds in the budget. The General Assembly also has the ability to, through the budget language for fiscal 23, to restrict other funding and make it available, or to authorize the governor to bring a budget amendment in to fund these programs. So the General Assembly also has some things that they can do. But the main approach is a supplemental budget from the governor.
Question, the effort adjustment, is that basically Baltimore, Prince George's County? What is that?
Yeah, so I'm gonna we can come back, but I will just move on to this slide right here, which is, so in terms of the school system funding, one of the key elements of the blueprint legislation, as passed by the General Assembly, was to provide additional funds to counties that were making a high education effort relative to their wealth. So low wealth counties making high effort, to help them pay for their share of the blueprint. And so for fiscal 23, you can see that Baltimore City should have received $99 million, and Prince George's County about $26.5 million to help them with the new additional local share costs associated with the blueprint formulas. The governor's office and the administration determined that from their perspective, the funds were not mandated for fiscal 23, so they did not include them in the budget. The General Assembly has a different view of that, and the Attorney General's office is being consulted with to advise on whether the funding is mandated for fiscal 23. Whether it is or isn't, again, the mechanism to get the funding into the budget is essentially the same as we just discussed for the other blueprint programs. Although this is a lot more money, so a supplemental budget would be needed to fund the education effort adjustment.
And that would have to be done by April, is that right?
Mhm, mhm.
So, excuse me, go ahead.
So I mean, a supplemental budget would need to come down before the budget passed in April.
Right.
That's what you meant. Mhm. Absolutely.
Well, you said that one way to make that happen is the governor has to be asked to do it. So
Yes.
would it be appropriate for the AIB to make such a request? Or does that come from the General Assembly?
A request can come from anyone, honestly, for a supplemental budget, and I think they do. But I certainly think it would be within the AIB's role to, request that funds that were intended to be part of the blueprint, if that aren't being funded, to ask him to
Right.
fund them.
I mean,
think
I'm
that-
especially.
Yeah, Britt, I would want to wait to see what that opinion is.
Okay.
And what, you have any time frame for getting that, Rachel?
The Attorney General's office is very aware of the high interest in this issue. So I know that they are working hard at sorting this out and coming to a opinion.
And is that likely to be part of discussion on our budget discussion a little later on? Before the General Assembly?
A part of the budget hearing?
Yeah.
Yes, I would imagine.
Okay, all right.
Well, I'm particularly concerned about this equity funding for Baltimore and
I
Prince
agree.
George's County.
Yeah. Rachel, can you just explain, is it just Baltimore City and Prince George's that did not receive the funding?
They are the only two counties, just to be clear, they're the only two counties that meet the criteria to receive funding in fiscal 23. So
Okay.
it's not that others received money and they didn't. They're the only two counties that are eligible.
They're eligible for it.
Mhm.
And the initial question is whether or not it was mandated or not in the original legislation.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
For fiscal 23.
Yeah.
I think that the disagreement is over whether in this first year of the program, whether it is mandated for fiscal 23. There's not a question of whether it's mandated for the rest of the years. It's just this very first year.
Gotcha. Okay.
Rachel, what happened?
Anything else on that? I interrupted you.
I have a question on this.
Mhm.
What happens if this is not remedied and Baltimore City and PG doesn't receive these funds?
So there are a couple things that can happen, but straight up what happens is that the Baltimore City government and the Prince George's County government will need to backfill these amounts to fully fund their school systems in fiscal 23. So Baltimore City would need to come up with another $99 million and Prince George's County would need to come up with another $26.5 million.
Let me go back again. That is to meet their obligation as it relates to the blueprint. They would have to do that.
Yes, to fund the local share, to fully fund the local share of the blueprint formulas
Right.
under the new maintenance of effort
Right.
requirements of the blueprint.
Yeah.
There are other, there are options, there are things that can be done to mitigate that. But that would, if the funding is not provided in some manner from a supplemental budget or some other way, then it would be a question of whether to essentially either the counties, local governments have to come up with the money or the school systems get less money. Those are kind of the only two options without additional funding coming in the budget.
And if the Attorney General doesn't see that this is indeed mandated and that the governor has the option to do it or not to do it, it seems unlikely that if this is the governor's default position, that he would respond affirmatively to any request. Am I missing something here?
I think it is just one of many legislative issues and considerations for this session as the Governor and General Assembly through the budget process and potential revenue actions come up with that, how they are going to utilize the additional revenues that have become available, much more than was originally projected, and in fact much more than the state has had, you know, in decades, in terms of monies that are available to utilize, either to save for the future in the rainy day fund, to fund, to make investments, and to, you know, potentially reduce taxes. So I think it is part of all of those discussions.
Yeah, I guess to clarify, and then I'll shut up, is whether it's mandated or not, this money has to run through the governor's office ultimately. There is no other way to unlock these funds.
For fiscal 23, there's always the possibility of a supplementary appropriation, but that requires a new revenue source. And that is, so like the sports betting revenues were being used for the supplementary appropriations for the AIB and the other blueprint programs. So, but this is a big number, $125 million to come up with that way. So, you know, I think most likely it is going to need the governor to bring in a supplemental budget, or, you know, to get more creative.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Dr. Lynch?
I just have a comment just to say that
Oh,
this
sorry.
this is extremely concerning in what I see here. I know I have a limited understanding of it, but from what I can see in our discussion, it's just very concerning.
Yeah, Rachel, I'm hoping that I just want to check all of our understandings. So taking Baltimore City as an example. So as it stands right now, Baltimore City would need to fund the additional $99 million to the school system, which means $99 million that would need to be allocated from other sources like libraries, fire, police, whatever is happening in Baltimore City's larger budget in order to make up for this deficit. Or they would simply not fund that 99 million to the schools, which means that their ability then to implement the blueprint, which would include things like raising teacher salaries, expanding CTE, community schools, would be impacted. Is that a correct assessment?
You definitely have the two pieces of the equation correct. Yes. So on this page, so we've talked about the education effort funding not being provided. The governor did provide additional funds for two programs. One is the compensatory education program, which is funding that is based on the number of free and reduced price meal students who are counted, who fill out the forms. And due to the, and I'm just gonna scroll down here, go in a different order here. You can see that on the right side of this chart is the free and reduced price meal counts. And you can see from fiscal 21, which was, so the fiscal 21 is pre-pandemic. That's the count from fall of 2019. So it's a little confusing, I know. But fiscal 21 is pre-pandemic. And now so 22, and then you can see a big drop in fiscal 22 from about 371,000 to 347,000. And then another big drop for in this current school year. So the fiscal 23 numbers are from the fall of 21, so the current school year. And so overall, the count is down by almost 50,000 students, 13%. It's extremely large. And so what the governor did in the allowance is he provided funding to hold harmless any district that would have received less compensatory education funding based on the lower count. And
Is there an explanation for that lower count?
yes, I think the thought is that because during the COVID pandemic, the federal government has been providing additional funding so that all students get free meals, regardless of your family income, and no one has to fill out a form. And so, I think families just aren't filling out the forms because they don't need to, because their students their kids are receiving free meals. And so that goes through this summer. The current federal funds go through this summer. And so the thought is that the count, we'll see how much it bounces back, but that the count will be closer to the pre-pandemic level, if not higher, after that federal funding goes away. However, I think we still will have a challenge. There's always been a challenge getting families to fill out the form, and not having had to fill it out for 2 years. I think that school systems may still see a lower count, lower than the pre-pandemic, possibly for another couple of years. And the filling out the form and how we count free and reduced price meal students is something that is still potentially something that through the blueprint that methodology will be changed because the forms are very challenging.
Rachel, that was my question, is does this include those schools that have CEP eligibility, or is that not included in this?
The count does not include it. So this is the actual count. But like, for example, Baltimore City is a community eligibility provision school system, meaning that if you achieve certain metrics, all of your students receive free meals. And so within the funding for the compensatory education formula, there is a CEP hold harmless provision that kicks in. And then the other enhancement is for full day pre-K. And this gets into a little more detail, but essentially fiscal 23 is the first year of a new full day pre-K funding formula under the blueprint. For the last 4 years, the state has been providing supplemental pre-kindergarten funding for full day pre-K students based on just a straight count of how many full day pre-K students you had enrolled, 4-year-olds. Starting with the blueprint formulas, that was sort of a temporary formula to start to incentivize and encourage school systems to expand their full day pre-K by funding those students. So now in fiscal 23, the blueprint has come into effect, and the formula starts to implement the mixed delivery system that the blueprint calls for. And as part of that, formula funding is provided for the lower income students, because we want to encourage school systems to bring more, we want to get, excuse me, the low income students into full day pre-kindergarten as a priority. And so the formula calls for counting kids that are from families at 300% or below of the federal poverty level. The challenge is that the 300% level is not data that is regularly collected by the public schools. It is the level that the pre-K expansion grant has been using, but what the school systems collect is 185% of poverty, which is the cutoff for free and reduced price meal students. And so when they ran the formula, the administration used the data that they had, which was the 185% count, to run the formula, which is below what the formula called for. And then they made up the difference and funded every student. So the enhancement funds are ensuring that school systems are getting the state per pupil funding for all of their full day pre-K students in the school year. So that is the full day pre-K enhancement funds. And I think my understanding is that MSDE is working on developing a data collection mechanism to collect the 300% data so that the formula can be run as it's intended in the future years. So I'm going to go backwards
A
here.
question on that, Rachel?
Mhm.
Just the full day kindergarten, I mean, it's not based on income for this because we don't measure income well enough. But is this based on past full day kindergarten enrollment?
It's based on, so all of the enrollment counts, pretty much all of the enrollment counts used for the pre-K 12 formulas are based on the most recent actual. So the enrollment in the current school year, which was taken back in September of this school year, is what is being used to calculate pretty much all of the funding formulas, including, so this was the program I was going to, so the biggest one is the foundation program, which is based on the full-time enrollment. And that again is from this most recent September. So the most recent actual data is being used to calculate the funding for the next fiscal year.
Right. Just an interesting assumption. If it's offered for free, more would likely take it. So, I would imagine the enrollments are going to grow beyond what they are currently. So,
it is a challenge, not just in the full day pre-K program, but as long as you want to fund based on actual students in seats, which is how the state has chosen to count enrollment, there's always going to be a lag. So I just wanted to briefly show you that overall, so these are all of the major state education aid programs. And the blueprint is providing additional funds through many of these existing formulas. Through the foundation program, the per pupil amount has increased. We just talked about compensatory. English language learners has increased. You can see by this $88 million. The special education formula has grown by 29%. And some of this is reflecting, some of this is reflecting changes in enrollment, but otherwise the enhancement is due to the increase in the per pupil funding above inflation. And then down here, there's this blueprint programs heading. So this is pretty much all of the other programs where the school systems are receiving funds through the blueprint law are kind of grouped under that blueprint programs heading. And then you can also see that there's about $211 million of COVID relief funds that the school systems are receiving in fiscal 22 that will go away next year. And there's also about $209 million that was provided to the school systems due to the drops in enrollment during the COVID pandemic that is also going away. So the net result of the increases from the blueprint formulas and these two COVID relief and the hold harmless funding going away results in an increase of about $314 million, about 5%, 4.7% to be exact. And that's what we call direct aid, meaning it goes directly to the school systems. The next line is retirement, which the state pays. The state portion is paid on behalf of the school systems. It doesn't actually go to them. So when we're talking about what the school systems are receiving, you're gonna hear it referred to as direct aid. And that's what that means. It does not include retirement.
Rachel, can I ask a question? The things that are going away, does that in any way have a disproportional impact on PG County, Prince George's, and Baltimore City? I'm just thinking about the funding that is already not coming to them, and then is there any additional impact of those losses, of those things going away?
So this chart here, we did do this comparison with and without COVID relief, because that was sort of one-time funding. The blueprint, the hold harmless funding was sort of, it was one time, but it was sort of reflecting what they would have received. So we didn't do that comparison, but I could do that for you if you'd like to see it. We certainly have what the hold harmless amounts are by LEA, but you can see that in the COVID relief column here, Prince George's and Baltimore City did receive, a very large share of the COVID relief funds. And so what this also helps you to see is if we're just sort of setting aside the COVID relief funds, how the growth in the budget is from 22 to 23. So that would mean that the 22 numbers are including those hold harmless funds. So this is growth comparing with the hold harmless money in the base. And you can see, based on what you would think you would see in terms of, the first year of the implementation of the blueprint formulas, you would expect a pretty healthy growth, and you're seeing it in this column, whereas it was a little hard to see that with the COVID relief money in there.
And so just so that I'm clear, so this does not include hold harmless. So this is based on current September 2021 enrollment numbers. Using that number, taking Allegheny as the first example, they will see this year a 9.4% increase over their funding from last year based on their existing student enrollment data, correct?
Yes, except that the fiscal 22 amount shown there for Allegheny and all of them, the $88.9 million, that includes the hold harmless funding because they received it in fiscal 22.
So that's sort of to my point, is that above the being held. So for districts that have seen a slide in enrollment, there's nobody that seems to have had a decrease in funding as a result of an adjustment in their student enrollment counts this year.
Or to put it a slightly different way, the growth in the formulas in the per pupil amounts is more than whatever is happening on the enrollment side, so that they're seeing these net increases. Exactly. And I will just show you, we looked at this briefly, but if you look at the full-time equivalent count, which is the foundation program uses this data, and that is far and away the largest aid program that we have. You can see that over the 3 years, enrollment is down about 3% statewide. And you can see that the big drop was from, this is again, fiscal 21 is fall of 19. So that's the pre-pandemic enrollment count of about 874,000 students down to 854,000, a little more in 22. A pretty big drop. And that is why the governor did provide the hold harmless funding for the current school year. And then enrollment is still down statewide in 23, but it's much smaller decrease of 6,000 students or so. And for the most part, every county is going down except for Frederick County, which is actually growing. And we did confirm this with the school system. And they do have some new developments that have opened up, and they do have more students. And then Worcester, on a percentage basis is 0, but they still did lose 19 students. So I think that covers what on the budget side, what I wanted to share with you. I'll just show you this. So similar with special education students, the trend is not quite as severe in terms of the numbers, but percentage wise, it's about a 4% decrease from pre-pandemic to the current school year. It does vary quite a bit by district. And then English language learners are actually, there was a drop, you can see, from pre-pandemic to the current school year, or last school year, excuse me. But then for fiscal 23, which is the current school year, the count is actually higher than the pre-pandemic count by about 5,000 students. And again, that really varies by district. And for English language learners, you want to look more at the numbers and not so much at the percent change, because the small districts of small number of students can be a very large percentage increase in the population. Are there, just make sure I covered everything, but are there any other questions at this point about any of these things?
Okay, if not, then we'll go into our executive session at this time.
We actually have one more presentation.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Let me share my screen again. Okay, and then let me actually, okay. Okay. Can everyone see that? Okay, so essentially, we've talked about this in terms of the blueprint timelines before, but really wanted to go into some detail on what the timeline is currently, and at least give you some things to think about about a possible new timeline to propose to the Governor and General Assembly in a fairly short time frame. And then also, more broadly, sort of lay out some of the many activities that the AIB and the board needs to accomplish in the next year or so. So here you have the original timeline that was in the blueprint law. Essentially, the Accountability and Implementation Board was established actually July 1, 2020, but that was pushed back as a result of the timing of the veto and the veto override. So using July 1, 2021 as the intended start date for the AIB, and then February 15th is when the law calls for the comprehensive implementation plan to be adopted by the AIB. And then with the process where MSDE would be developing the criteria that would be used for them to make a recommendation to the AIB about whether to approve or disapprove a plan, would be April 1st. And then the implementation plans from the various governmental units, not the least of which are all the school systems, would be submitted to the AIB for review and approval this June 15th. So those are the dates that are in the blueprint law currently. And then what we're going to do is try to kind of layer on top of this sort of what has actually happened up to this point. And so the first difference is the timing of when the AIB actually started. And so in that case, what this is reflecting is your first meeting, your very first meeting, which was November 15th of 2021. And then the next date is today, which is the first day that the AIB, officially has its an executive director and one staff member. And then the next date are the things that we talked about with the budget. So in April, there will be 5 permanent staff positions available. And then in July will be the additional 10 positions available for the AIB to be fully staffed up. And so essentially, if you look at that timeline, just straight up, the AIB was intended to begin July 1st. And in terms of being fully staffed and actually ready to, to operate at full capacity, it's going to take an additional year. That is not to say that the expectation was that it would be fully staffed on July 1st of 2021 either. That was just the start date. But things are moving fairly slowly, although as quickly as they can in some ways. And so this next slide is showing, essentially it's taking the time that was originally intended between when the AIB was starting and when the implementation plan would be adopted. So July 1 to February 15th, so that's 7.5 months, and kind of superimposing that on the current reality, which is that the AIB could begin working on the plan in March. And that would then provide an October date for when a plan would be put forward. In this case, it would be a draft plan. So this is a little different than the blueprint law did not specify a timeline for a draft plan. It was just for the final plan. And so this is, again, just a possible timeline for you all to think about and ask questions about. This would provide for that 7.5 months to develop a draft plan that would then be shared and officially put out for public comment. But just to be clear, along the way, there would be lots of public sessions and discussions. So whatever does come out in a draft plan wouldn't be a surprise to the public or anyone who was participating, because the intent is that much of the planning work and developing work for the plan will be done, in public sessions.
Rachel, why don't you look at a very good chart here in terms of following the arrows. For example, between March and October, you have a line that goes between that I assume reflects what you just talked about, the things that will be happening.
Exactly.
And so that would include what now?
And so also, so there's that. And then also on the bottom of the chart is sort of by like quarters of the calendar year is sort of like listing some of the key work that would be happening related to the timeline, to the comprehensive implementation plan. And so as you, in the spring, in April to June, the process would begin in terms of sorting out what the plan should look like, what you want it to look like, and how you want to develop it. And then also the plan has needs to span 12 years. So the full implementation of the blueprint will happen 12 years from now, essentially, from fiscal 23. But in the very immediate term, for like the next 1 to 2 years, there are specific activities and milestones that I think the AIB could identify, before the plan is done, to provide some guidance to the school systems as they move forward for the next school year, implementing pieces of the blueprint. And so that is part of what would happen in this spring and into the early summer. And then also in the summer, to start working with the LEAs to figure out what type of training and technical assistance would they need, what would be helpful to them, and starting to put that in place, working with our partners at MSDE and other partners. And then also, as I said, holding public plan development sessions in order to come up with a draft of a plan, a 12-year plan, in October. And then once the draft plan is completed, that would, go out for public comment, and presumably there would be, public hearings where, we would invite folks to come and share their comments with the AIB, possibly, in regional places around the state. And then also in the fall, that is when the training and technical assistance for the school systems would really ramp up. So even though it would just be a draft plan at that point in October, there would be a lot of training and technical assistance happening so that the school systems could already be thinking about what their blueprint implementation plan will look like, and start working on it. And then there would also be, in that time frame between October and December, MSDE would submit the criteria that it's proposing to use to make a recommendation to the AIB about whether to approve or disapprove a school system's plan. And the AIB would be reviewing those criteria and either approving them or asking for changes, revisions to them. And then under this possible timeline, then in December of 2022 is when the AIB, after the public comment and hearings and whatever revisions are made to the plan as a result of that, the plan would be adopted by the AIB in December. And then the school systems would have until likely March 31st, March of 2023 to develop and submit their implementation plans. And that timing would then allow the AIB to spend the spring of 2023 reviewing the local plans and other plans that need to be submitted, but with the goal of either approving or going through a revision process by early summer, so that the school systems would really have the summer time between the school years to ramp up their implementation of the plan, of their approved plans.
I'll ask you a question, which is the central portion of this. Assuming the following: that we get all of the positions that we've discussed earlier, the 5 in April, the 15 in July. We receive the competent budget resources from the sports betting. And we get buy-in from all of our various partners along the way. Is this plan realistic and operational to meet what you've just described?
I believe it is. I
Okay,
think we might need to use some, we might need to bring on some other assistance in some areas. But yes, I think it is doable.
now I won't make sure that everybody heard what I said to get there, that we receive all of the support that I've just described in terms of personnel, the resources in terms of the monies that we should have, and that there is essential buy-in from all of our partners along the way. Under those conditions, what we are saying, at least what the recommendation is that we can meet the deadlines outlined in this plan. It is not without the caveats that I've just described. They would have to be included in our ability to go forward. There are comments or questions about what we see before us.
I see
Yeah, I
Mr.
mean-
Nanko's hand up.
Yeah, so, I mean, this more or less pushes the implementation back pretty much a full year. And just, you know, your thoughts on just implications for that overall. I mean, I think it gives us the time and space in order to try to do this correctly and not, you know, not be rushed and be very thoughtful about the implementation, staff up appropriately, gain, you know, get out into the field and get feedback from practitioners and from, you know, people who the implementation will impact. So I think all of those things are extremely positive. It does delay implementation for a year. So just your thoughts on implications for what that means for kids throughout the state, you know, practitioners, what's going on the ground. Yeah.
But Joe, I think that there will be some things that we will do in the interim that will help us along the way. So it wouldn't be as though we're going to wait a year and then start from scratch. There will be individual components of things that I think that we can do along the way. And I think your key point that you made earlier, i.e. that we want to do this right, because we're looking at a plan that should hold up for a long period of time. And unless we do this right, we can harm the entire implementation going forward for a number of years. So I'd rather be thoughtful and a little bit more predictable about what we're doing and not overpromise, but to do this right rather than to meet artificial deadlines that may get us in trouble going forward.
If I could just add, I did think about that, and I do think that is a concern, and that is why what I'm proposing here is that the AIB spend time this spring really digging into the key milestones in each of the 5 policy areas or pillars, as we're now calling them, and really identify what those key activities are and should be, and then meet with the various school systems to hear from them about what they've been doing in terms of blueprint implementation thus far, and then what they're going to be doing for the upcoming school year, to focus on those key milestones so that we don't lose a year, because we don't want to lose a year of implementing the blueprint. We can't lose a year. And quite frankly, the school systems are going to be receiving funding to implement pieces of this. And so there needs to be some guidance on implementation for the upcoming school year. And I think that we can provide that not separate from the implementation plan, but like as the first piece of developing the implementation plan. And then we can focus on the rest of the time frame, you know, once we get some guidance out about the most urgent things. I
Rachel?
see
Yeah,
Dr. Kerr.
Rachel? Oh,
Yes,
Sorry, just overall, super helpful to hear that, and full agreement with you, Ike. Like, I think everybody on this board and everybody throughout the state wants to do this correctly, and you know, I think really balancing the urgency of the moment with, you know, trying to do this very deliberately and with a lot of feedback and in a thoughtful manner is really the most important component of this. So, you know, total agreement with your comments, and thank you, Rachel, for you know, providing some clarity.
Rachel?
yes,
Uh,
Dr. Kerwin.
So in the original timeline, the local LEAs had what, about 3 months to develop their plans after we did our work with our implementation plan, right?
They had 4 months.
4 months. And in this model, they still have 4 months, right? Did you hear any commentary just initially that whether or not 4 months was adequate time for them?
I'm not sure. I guess I would say anecdotally, I've heard from the school systems that they are concerned about that time frame.
Yeah.
And that was part of why I proposed a draft plan
Yeah.
and then a final plan.
Right.
So that in a lot of ways gives them more than
Right.
4 months.
I see two positive benefits for having the draft out, and because, you know, the draft will be, might be changed, but it gives them a pretty good snapshot of what the expectations are. So they can certainly start working in October based on that snapshot. I also think giving the public, public airing of this has some real merit. And so, although it was not originally proposed that we have a draft plan first, I think what you've suggested here to me has a number of benefits.
I agree. We also will have an opportunity to meet with the state system on, when is it, Thursday?
Yes, the state superintendent and the state board president. Yep.
Yeah. Would they have had an opportunity to see this by the time?
I will definitely share this with them. They may be watching, but I will definitely share this with them as soon as the meeting is over.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Because we want to do this in collaboration with them, but I think what you proposed is it is an excellent start. If there are suggestions or ideas, we're not going to adopt this today. We're going to wait to talk to our partners on Thursday, and hopefully, if we're in an agreement, we can have an up or down vote on this, I think, next week, so that by the time we have an opportunity to meet before the General Assembly, they will see what this plan is like and why we made the adjustments that we, as they're laid out here. But we're not going to vote on it today. But, further questions or comments, we will have another week or so in order to contemplate this, as well as the opportunity to talk on Thursday with others about what we propose.
And just to add to that, also share this with, and I'm sure some of them are watching, the local school superintendents and school systems, so that we want to get their feedback on this potential timeline as well.
Yeah.
And
again,
Oh,
go ahead, Joe.
oh no, that was just my question, Rachel, in terms of feedback over the next week on the timeline, and what the plan is to solicit input from community partners, from local LEAs, from the State Department, and what role you needed us to play in that. If you need us to, be present within the field, or if you have a plan. I mean, clearly you're the sole staff member right now, so it's a lot of it's a lot of kind of solicitation of feedback if it's just on you. But I for one am happy to reach out to folks and get some feedback on what this plan means for them, and if there's recommendations and modifications that will help to improve it and make it better.
Any question from the public or anyone else in reference to why we're at this dateline or this timeline? We need to go back, if you can, flip back to the earlier, there we go. And you see the adjustments. And so these two charts should be looked at simultaneously, at least overlapping each other. So you can see the time for which we've started, from the time that we've had an opportunity to organize ourselves, to the time that we are now actually beginning with limited staff to achieve what we now have on the other side, which is the new time frame. And so an explanation, these two charts should be looked at together as an explanation as to why we're at the position we are today. But we're not going to rush this in order to simply meet an artificial deadline that is inconsistent with trying to do this in a way that I think is efficient and will lay the proper foundation for the many years to follow. But these two things should be looked at together.
And I just like to say that this is a point of reality, I guess. And I'm looking at the budget as well that Rachel just went over. And I keep going back to the LEAs and the timing for them to be able to put forth a plan. I'm also going back to, because it's sticking in my mind, the funding for Prince George's County and for Baltimore City that was not there, and we don't know if that's going to stay. But right now it's not there, and how this timeline impacts that, and that for me is another reason why we need to be able to, I don't want to say delay, but to be able to make the timeline align more realistically with some of these items that we are dealing with, that I just kind of put forward.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Any further questions on the proposed timeline for consideration for next week?
I just have a couple more. Oh, Dr. Stapleton, I just saw your hand.
I was just going to ask if, throughout the blueprint, there are some other embedded timelines. And I'm just wondering if we're going to tackle them all at this point, or say, once we have these comprehensive plans in place, then we'll revisit the out timelines.
My thought was that we tackle the immediate deadlines first, and then as we work through the comprehensive implementation plan, we will, as we're working through that, the various dates and timing are going to be part of that discussion. And to the extent that the AIB thinks there need to be changes to those timelines, then we could propose that both in the comprehensive plan and also in the annual report that the AIB needs to submit each year in November. And that is that was sort of designed as the first opportunity to put forward where there may need to be some tweaks or changes to the blueprint law. And I was sort of moving on to the next slide, just because that is on this one, submit the annual report. But I'll go back here. So the other thing that are in these two slides is just sort of in addition to all the work that needs to be done to develop and the comprehensive implementation plan and get all of that up and running. This is just sort of some of the key activities that the AIB is going to need to work on. First and foremost, of course, is developing a staffing plan, an actual budget, and hiring up and training staff. We also have the advisory committees that we talked about, needing to get those up and running. And then, a critical piece of, laying the foundation for the blueprint is developing and establishing, communications and working protocols with all of the various partners who are involved in implementing the blueprint, starting, of course, with the governor and the General Assembly, with, of course, the State Board and the State Department of Education. I won't read them all, but, there are a lot of partners involved in implementing the blueprint, all of whom that are actual governmental type groups will need to actually submit implementation plans to the AIB, but also, the community organizations, the grassroots organizations, the stakeholders, the parents. So lots of folks that we want to make sure we're reaching out to and that we're working with on a regular basis. And then, each school system and county has a blueprint implementation coordinator. So they are, for the local implementation of the blueprint, they are sort of the ones who have the most knowledge about what's going on in their jurisdiction. So we definitely want to be working with the blueprint coordinators, specifically, to Mr. Manco's point on sort of what's happening now, what are the barriers to success or implementation, barriers to implementation, and what are the successes that they're having, and building on those successes in the next, in the very short term, as we're developing the full implementation plan, and then making sure that we know what type of training and technical assistance they need, and sorting out, what role the AIB will have in delivering that training and technical assistance, and in partnership with MSDE, and sort of figuring some of those things out. Other things that the law requires the AIB to do is actually to provide some blueprint training to those expert review teams, if they're funded. And then also working with MSDE on the blueprint, what we call blueprint training programs, but really they're school leadership training programs, both for the the state and local superintendents and sort of the higher level senior staff in each school system, and then with the state board and the local boards and the school principals themselves. There's also a blueprint public outreach program to make sure that the public is aware of what the blueprint's goals are and intended outcomes, and to keep the public informed, and allow them to provide feedback. The annual report, and so this first one in November, I think, obviously, potentially there could be, especially in dates, a number of potential changes that the AIB might want to recommend. And then we've talked about this briefly, I think, but in the statute, there is a program evaluation that's required, both a short-term program evaluation and then one towards the end of the implementation period. And so that the first program evaluation report is due in October of 2024. And so we want to start working towards getting an RFP out and someone under contract, so that when the blueprint plan is is ready to go, that we've got our evaluators on board to be tracking the progress. And then the last slide is just the immediate next steps, which are, we talked about this, vetting the timeline, and then proposing the new timeline and to the Governor and General Assembly, and they can decide what they want to do with that at that point. Developing a staffing plan, a budget, and a plan for how we're going to accomplish all these activities in the next year. And standing up a whole brand new agency. Most importantly, getting a website up and running so that we can begin to communicate with the public more. And then start on developing the plan, but especially the process that we want to use to write the plan. And that's it.
Thank you, Rachel. Any questions, comments? Let me just add a comment or two here, because I think it's important for us to recognize where we are today, the many challenges that have been outlined and the amount of work that's ahead of us. The difficulties of not having all the staff, the resources, and everything else. And you've seen a fairly aggressive, comprehensive plan to address all of those things. And it looks good on paper. But I've seen over the years an awful lot of what I consider to be excellent plans on paper. And seldom does it ever go precisely the way it was intended. There are an awful lot of players in this process, from members of the public, our partners around the state, members of the General Assembly. There are naysayers that are out there. And so as we attempt to move forward, we should keep in mind that we may have some challenges along the way and difficulties trying to meet all the deadlines that we see outlined. And it requires of us to be diligent, forthright, and resolute about how we're going to get there, and making certain that we have the resolve to try to make the best possible case for what we are doing and achieving the overall objectives. But there will be a mix-up or two. There will be some disappointments. There will be some of our partners that may disappoint us along the way. So it looks good on paper, but I've seen an awful lot of good plans on paper. People talk about crisis management. That's before and afterwards. The real crisis is, how do you deal with the crisis when you're in the midst of the crisis? And I would predict that somewhere along the line, despite all that we see before us, we're going to be in the midst of crisis. And we should expect that, especially given the challenge that we've already had getting started. So I'm very optimistic. I'm resolute about getting there. And I'm not easily deterred about some challenges along the way. But I wanted to remind us that we will have those challenges as we go forward. So thank you, Rachel, for a very aggressive and well thought out plan. Hopefully we'll get an opportunity a little bit later on to evaluate that with some of our partners. And in the very near future, we'll get a chance to adopt that and make a recommendation to the General Assembly and inform the governor and others about the adjustment that we're seeking in the plan. Any other comments or questions? Not. Let me go back and pull up the question for executive session. Can find it here.
I can put it on the screen if that's helpful.
I've got it here somewhere. Wait a minute. Yeah, please do. Okay. In accordance with the Open Meeting Act, the General Provisions Act, Article 35305B-13, the board will meet in closed session to discuss confidential budget and administrative matters. Is there a motion to the effect?
Make the motion.
There's a second to the motion.
I'll second.
Been moved and properly second. All in favor? Are there any questions or comments about the motion? Clarifications? If not, all in favor of the motion indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposition? The ayes have it. We will now go into closed session. And I think take 5 minutes, make the other link, and we'll get there pretty quickly. Thank you.